I would like to begin by stating, of course, that this is my devar and it's based on my own readings and opinions and not representative of Beit Aleph, Rabbi Olivier, or any other persons or groups. I'd also like to say I had a bunch of stuff in here that was really irrelevant, but since this is what's going to stand between us and eating cookies, I edited a lot out, so if you have more questions or want to talk about stuff or just talk about Torah, please find me at the Oneg. So when I sit down to study Torah, I tend to read until something stands out as surprising or interesting, and then I veer off into commentaries and citations and whatever little rudimentary Hebrew knowledge I have until I can make some sense of the passage. So this week's Torah portion is Vayeira, and Vayeira is right smack in the middle of the Abraham story. And it's an odd collection of narratives. So angels come to meet with Abraham, and they say that Sarah is going to have a son. And then they go to, and then they destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And then for the second time, and I'm not really sure why it happens again, but it is the second time, Abraham decides to tell everybody that Sarah is his sister and not his wife, and she ends up getting married to a king. Second time. And then so then Isaac gets born, of course, and then Ishmael and Hagar are cast out, and then Abraham trades some livestock for a well, and finally Abraham takes Isaac up to Mount Moriah. So, got a lot going on here, and there's some real blockbuster biblical stories in here, but it's one of the quieter stories that I found more interesting this time on this pass-through, and my last couple of pass-throughs on this portion. So after Isaac is weaned, Sarah looks at Ishmael playing, and she tells Abraham that she doesn't want Ishmael to have a portion of Isaac's inheritance, and that he and Hagar need to be cast out. Now, Abraham doesn't want to do this because Ishmael is still his son, but God reassures him that Ishmael will be a great nation of his own. So Abraham sends Ishmael and Hagar out into the wilderness with a loaf of bread and a skin of water. And that's it. They soon run out of water, so Hagar decides to put Ishmael underneath a bush and goes to sit far enough away that she won't have to watch him die, and she begins to weep. Then an angel comes and tells her that God has heard Ishmael's cries, and God will save him. So God shows Hagar where there's a well, and she fills the skin with more water and gives it to Ishmael, who then survives and grows up to be an archer and settles in the land of Haran. This is a pretty short passage. This is 13 verses. But it brings up a lot of questions. On first pass-through, it seems like it's a story about a baby in peril. I mean, Hagar waiting a distance away from an abandoned child makes you think about Miriam and Moses. But then you pause to think for a moment, and you realize that Abraham was 86 when Ishmael was born, and he was 100 when Isaac was born. So Ishmael has to be at least 14 when this happens, and yet he's helpless underneath a bush. This is a very strange... Nobody talks about this, but this is going on. And then there's also the place that they wander to and run out of water in. It's Beersheba, and that's strange. It's specified by name, but the name was only explained in the next story. In that story, Abraham is going to give King Abimelech 7 sheep in exchange for acknowledgement that he dug a well. So Beer means well, and Sheva means oath, and it can also mean 7. So Beersheba either means well of 7 or well of an oath, and kind of means both. So not only is this place named before it is named, but the name is a prominent feature of it that would save everybody's life. So why is this? And she was part of the household, so if he had dug this previously, then she probably would have been aware of it. But the thing that really struck me this time, and I hadn't really thought about it on any of my previous pass-throughs, is that throughout this story, Ishmael is not actually named. He's referred to in euphemisms. He's referred to as the son of Hagar, and he's referred to as the son of the slave woman, and he's referred to simply as Hana'ar, just the boy. But the name Ishmael is not used. And so noticing that, it's worth taking a moment to think back on what the name actually is. So back in chapter 16, Sarai had become jealous when Hagar got pregnant, and Sarai abused Hagar until she ran away. An angel then found her at a spring and told her that she needed to return to Sarai and that she should have her son and name him Yishmael. So the El at the end, that's God. El is a name of God. So anytime you hear El, in most names, it's God. Then the Yud at the beginning is making the verb into a future tense. And then there's the root, and it's a root that we all know. It's Shin, Mem, Ayin. It's Shema. So Shema means to listen, but it's not a passive hearing. It's an active listening and taking that listening to be a force driving your actions. So Ishmael means God will listen, and that listening will be a catalyst for God's action and protection. At the time he was named, this seemed to be in reference to saving Hagar when she ran away. But now in this story, it is Ishmael that God has heard. And this story is also important because it marks the end of the narrative for several prominent characters. Ishmael disappears after this point, and he only comes back briefly to help Isaac bury Abraham, and Hagar doesn't return at all. This is also the last thing Sarah does before she dies, is this act of casting away this child. And while it is true that Ishmael is not actually called out by name in the story, the name does actually appear when you read between the lines. Verse 17 begins, Vayishma Elohim et kol hana'ar. He's still called the boy here, but Yud, Shin, Mem, Ayin, Aleph, Lamed is tucked away in the text. God heard the cry of the boy. So where does this bring us today? We still have children out in the desert and in the wilderness, without shelter and with the wells being hidden. Earlier this week, the retrial of Scott Warren began in Arizona. Those not familiar, Dr. Warren is a humanitarian who is working with the No More Deaths Camp group to provide food, water, and shelter to people in the border region and spread awareness of abusive behaviors by the Border Patrol. He's been charged with harboring undocumented immigrants and conspiracy. This is the second trial after the first one ended in a hung jury. If you'd like to find out more about this case or support the group's mission, they can be found online at nomoredeaths.org. And there's a really interesting wrinkle to this case that ties us back to the Parshat. Since the prosecution's case depends on demonstrating that the Border Patrol agents were not engaging in profiling and not arresting group members in retaliation for their work or acting with any kind of racial malice, the prosecution made a last-minute pretrial motion that the judge granted. The defense is not allowed to mention the changes in immigration policy that have come along in the last few years or anything about the current administration, in particular, a certain well-known name. But it is still very clearly there between the lines when you stop to look. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.